So, okay, let's get started. Let's open source diversity and inclusion and figure out what the heck did I mean by that. So again, I am Demetris Cheatham. I'm the Senior Director for Diversity and Inclusion Strategy at GitHub. Been there for about 2 years now. And I have to tell you about my time at GitHub, specifically when I was interviewing. So I was interviewing with Erica Brescia, who sends her love and regards for Scale, by the way. When I told her I was coming here, she was like, oh my gosh, I remember when it got started and all these things, and they're my friends. So she told me to make sure that I told you all hello. But Erica Brescia was the COO of GitHub at the time where I was interviewing, and so she was interviewing me, and she asked that all-important question. You know the question that's going to come up in every single interview you do. She said, Demetris, why do you want to join GitHub? You see, she had just finished talking to me about how GitHub was actually approaching diversity and inclusion in a much more holistic way. Most of the time when you hear about diversity and inclusion, they have it right in HR, which is what I used to do at Red Hat, and it's so important to be there. But GitHub was now approaching it from looking at their platform. When I started, it was 50 million developers a little under 2 years ago, and now they're at 83 million developers. They were looking at it from their philanthropy or their social sector, their giving. They were also looking at it from people, which is their HR perspective, and they were also looking at it through their policy efforts. And so when she asked me why did I want to join, I gave her this little tongue-in-cheek answer. I said, Erica, I want to join GitHub because I want to open source diversity and inclusion. And I smiled at her, and she smiled at me, and I guess it was a good answer because I'm here. So after I started, they let me go through my own boarding, figure out where the virtual bathrooms were on Slack and all those things. And then all of a sudden she said, okay, Demetris, now go open source diversity and inclusion. I was like, oh, you remember that? What does that mean? I didn't know. So I just started doing what I love to do anyway. I just started talking to as many people in open source that I can. I got on Twitter, anybody's name that I saw talking about DEI and open source, I was DMing them, asking them could they just have a quick coffee chat with me. And over the course of hundreds of conversations, there were some themes that started to come out. The first was, inclusion happens at the community level. You see, when someone new comes into open source, their first 1 or 2 interactions in their first community really sets the tone on whether or not they're going to stay in open source. If they have a really positive and inclusive experience, they say, you know what? Those open source folks, they're my people, and they're here to stay. But if they have a negative interaction, someone ignores their contribution, someone doesn't respond to them, they say, you know what, I don't feel welcome here. And they're gone, and research is saying they're often gone for good. And so then when we started looking at the community level, I said, well, who's responsible for driving inclusion in the community? And overwhelmingly, people said maintainers or community leaders were the ones that's responsible. You have to think about maintainers or community leaders like your managers if you're working for a corporation or organization, right? You can build all of these amazing corporate programs, these trainings that everyone has to take, these mandatory, tutorials and education materials. But all of a sudden, if you take these mandatory trainings and you go back into your team, your day-to-day experiences will undo anything that you've learned on these trainings. So it's the manager. You need me to stay right here? I'm not moving. Okay. And I'm a walker when I talk, so I'm just going to keep going back and forth. That's good? All right. So it was really those managers that set the tone for inclusion. So when I started talking to those community leaders and those managers, I said, well, what do you need? What can we give you? And they were like, please don't come with more trainings. They were like, we have education materials. There's podcasts. There's articles. Every conference that we go to, people are talking about it constantly and constantly. We are overwhelmed with material. And so I said, well, if you have all the resources you need, what's the issue? And that's where the conversation started to, just break up a little bit. So when I talked to managers of smaller communities, they said, yes, we have the resources. We also have the influence with our community because we're speaking with our users and our contributors almost on a weekly basis, but we don't have the time and we don't have the bandwidth. We are all about trying to get hands on the keyboards, contributors from wherever we can get them from. We don't have time to focus on inclusion. So I said, okay, well, if this is what the community leaders of the smaller communities are saying, what about of the larger communities? And what they shared was, yes, we have the resources, we have the time, we have the bandwidth, but now our community has gotten so large, we can't easily influence the culture. If someone's not doing something they're supposed to, it gets a little harder to pick up the phone or send a quick message to them. So you had this tension point. The time in which you needed to focus on advancing inclusion in your community was the time when you didn't have the time to do it, right? So what do? But one thing, no matter what community leader I spoke to, large or small, they said, here's what we know. Regardless of what we do, there are still some really, really great barriers to entry from people even being able to get to open source. So they said we could build the most inclusive, fun community there is, but if we don't address those barriers, if we don't address that wall that's there, no one's even going to be able to get to our communities. So this was a classic case of if we build it, they will come, not if there's that big wall that's there in the middle. So that's what we wanted to address. That's where the equity comes into play. And so that's what we've set out to do with this open source community called All In. All In is going to answer that question and do that thing that I said in my interview. We're going to open source diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we're going to do so through access, community, equity, and data. So we kicked off All In this community about a year ago, as a matter of fact. And so during that first year, we said we wanted to do 3 things, and which we have checked off all 3 of those and moving forward. So I'm here to share about those 3 things. The first thing was we needed to kick off an open source diversity, equity, and inclusion survey. There were a lot of surveys out there. There were many for individual communities, but there wasn't really a broad survey that kind of cut across all of the different open source communities. We had done a little bit of survey work on our platform at GitHub, but I made sure to let them know GitHub is important. We are a major player, but we're not the only player. There are so many communities on other platforms that are in other forums, and we need to understand what their sentiments are about diversity, equity, inclusion if we're going to advance inclusion in open source. The second thing was we kicked off a maintainers listening tour. Again, if maintainers are the ones that's instrumental in advancing diversity and inclusion in open source, we really need to hear from them in a more structured and formal way. And then the third thing, which I'm so excited to tell you about because we're almost finished with this one, we kicked off an all-in 12-month pilot, and this first year was focused on students, and we're getting ready to kick the one that's focused on maintainers. So let's talk about this survey. So again, we didn't want to just do it right on GitHub's platform. So we partnered with the Linux Foundation, and we introduced this survey over 60 some odd questions, close to 70 questions. And if you are a data nerd like I am, please go and read this 64-page report. If you say that you don't have data for open source, diversity, inclusion, and open source, you have not looked at this report. Please go there. And so when we did the survey, it was some surprising things that came out for me. Because I've heard so much about how, open source is not a welcome inclusion. There are some really big issues of, things that's making it so that it's not a great place anymore. But when we surveyed, and it was a representative sample, we found that 82% of survey respondents said, I feel welcome in open source. They agree with this statement. I can tell you this, if you go to any company and they get an 82% approval rating from their employees, they're going to be popping bottles and there's going to be confetti raining from the ceiling. That is a darn good number. But guess what? That's not the work of diversity and inclusion. We needed to give voice and hear the stories of the 18% that did not agree with that statement. What were their stories? What were their experiences? What were they facing? Because I can tell you, what's in that 18%, that's probably what's keeping millions of others from even attempting to come into open source. Those are the stories that they're oftentimes hearing. So we needed to hear from the 38% of non-binary or third gender contributors who said that they didn't feel welcome in open source. What are the 29% of people of color, specifically in North America? What are their experiences? 26% of women said that they do not feel welcome in open source. 25% of persons with disabilities. And we can't forget about that 15% over there of men that said that they did not feel welcome in open source. And amazingly enough, that number was composed mainly of white men in North America. And so that was something that was just mind-blowing to me. That's where we had to dig in. That's where we needed to see what was going on. And so we got over 10,000 written comments that our data analysts went through. And here's what we found. Oh, you told me to stay still. Sorry. Okay, I need like one of those little stick things up here. Okay, so here's what we found. Most people did not feel welcome if they didn't have the technical skills and knowledge that they felt was necessary to contribute to a community. But the interesting part about it was when I talked to maintainers and community leaders, they were sharing with me all of these very important and critical responsibilities of a community that did not require technical skills. Things that people could do while they were building up their technical skills. So why was it that when someone was coming to the communities without the technical skills, they were made to feel inferior? That was something that we knew we needed to look at. Lack of response and rejections to contributions. The interesting part about it is contributors were saying, I will send an email or a response or a message to the community leader and would never hear back, or they would wait 3 or 4 weeks before I could hear back. And so what the maintainers, especially of those smaller communities, they were like, we're drowning here, we're busy. Like, we don't have time to respond all the time. It's not because we're disrespecting them or don't value them, we just don't have the time. Your new contributors don't know that. If you don't have your documentation that's setting up expectations for when you can respond, how to engage, they're thinking that you just don't want them into your community, and nothing could be further from the truth. Along those same lines, especially amongst women, they just felt like their voice isn't heard. Their contributions aren't valued. There was one comment that really, really stuck out to me, and this person that responded to the survey said, if I am not white, if I am not male, if I am not rich, if I am not highly educated, no one wants to hear from me. And we know that in open source, that is not the case. But that's how a lot of the people that were responding to the survey were feeling. And finally, microaggressions and stereotypes in written communications. This was a really, really big one, especially when you started looking at international respondents. So you had really high numbers of feeling welcome in India. You had high numbers in the continent of Africa. But when you started looking into Spanish-speaking countries, especially South America, Portugal, Brazil, in which the numbers that are of people contributing to open source are going up higher and higher every day, they said they didn't feel welcome at all, and most of the time there were language barriers, cultural barriers there. So those are some of the things that we need to be thinking about as well. We have to get to the point that in open source, inclusion is not the exception. It is the norm. Like, it's not looking where we're seeing, giving awards for people being exemplary. Like, everyone should be doing that. And I think that it's possible for us to get there. So the second thing that we did was the Maintainers Listening Tour. And so we kicked off a series of focus groups, individual interviews, as well as an online forum for people to submit feedback. We asked them questions. What do you need? What are some of the challenges? What's working? What's not working? What are the gaps? We got so much rich information in that. And so I released a talk, and you can find it on our website, on some of the top 6 things that we've learned, like those 6 themes. But I can tell you, we're doing the final report of it, and every day I keep looking. I think we were supposed to release it back in May, and I was like, it's too much information, and they keep telling me to cut it and cut it. I was like, but I can't. So we're trying to figure out the best way to release that. Your maintainers and your community leaders, they actually have the answers. They've just never been given the opportunity to communicate it. And so I have a meeting next week with some leading researchers at some universities, because I said, I need you all at the table. They're giving us the sentiment. You all need to give us the data and the research. Then I'm going to the corporations and the foundations to give us the money to build the solutions and tools that they're asking us for. Like, one of the things that they said was, hey, everybody's telling us how to solve for, diversity and inclusion, and everything they tell us is this long manual process that'll take us hours to do. They were like, can't somebody build a tool or a script for that? And I was like, oh, we are developers, aren't we? And we just need to give someone money to develop the tools. So at GitHub, we definitely will be kicking off a major grant program for developers to build some of the tools that these maintainers said that they need, and we're going to make sure that they're freely available to everyone that needs them. So I want to talk about the next thing, all in a 12-month pilot. We were going to do one for the students and the maintainers within the first year, but we got so involved with these amazing students that I'm getting ready to tell you about. I told the maintainers they have to wait, and we're going to kick that off in a couple of months now. So with these students, we went to universities that are usually overlooked and no one is showing up on their campuses. Those are schools like historically black colleges and universities, and not those top 5 or 6, but those ones that no one's going to. And we also went to a school that was founded for the education of Native Americans in the United States. And so we went to the schools and said, we don't want to put up an application process, because even filling out an application or an essay, that's a privilege and a barrier in and of itself as well. We want those students that really deserve a chance, and we asked the schools to select them for us. That's all we did. We said, send us our top 5 students, and we're going to work with them. We're going to give them, during their fall semester, they got open source education, which was open source 101, learning about the language, what is a community, what is a repo, what's a maintainer, how do you make your first pull request, what do you do, all of those things there. And we offered them professional development, because you can give someone the technical skills, but there are some things that all of us wish we had known when we first started in our first job, especially in a corporation, right? Like, what do you do when you're the only one on a team? Like, how do you deal with microaggressions? How do you leverage your employee resource groups? How do you deal with equity when you get it? Most of these students were from very, very underserved communities and under-resourced. When they come out of school, they will be making more money than pretty much everyone in their family. So we wanted to make sure that we even gave them financial education. So that's what we focused on during the fall semester. During the spring semester, we then partnered them with Major League Hacking so that they got experience for 12 weeks actually participating in an open source community. We just didn't give them the theory and the academics and just put them through training. They got experience actually sometimes learning how to code for the first time, even though they were sophomores and juniors. And they got experience with actually presenting their code, learning their communication skills. And all of this was to get them ready for a summer internship experience with one of our corporate partners. And so we are in week 8 of 10, so the students are actually almost finished with their internships. When we started, over 90% of the students in our pilot had never heard of open source before. Over 90% had never had a summer internship before. And I'm proud to say that we placed all of them, 100% of them, many of them in their first open source internship experience. And I have to tell you about these amazing students. You know, one of the things about it is if you go to any school, if you get those that's in the top 10% GPA, they'll find their way to an experience, right? Someone will eventually, hire them. we knew that GPA is not the only aptitude for success. The students in our program, some of them are commuting 2 hours each way to school every day because they can't afford to stay on campus. Some of them are full-time caregivers, especially during the pandemic, where they have to live at home, or they have kids. We have full-time parents that are in our program. You have students that are working part-time, full-time, or they are active duty military because that's the way they're paying for college. And then you also have some that were on academic scholarship, because my question to them was, why don't you have an internship? And they were like, we have to train during the summer because otherwise we can't afford to go to school. We're here on scholarship. And so I'm like, so if you are a scholar athlete, that takes you out of the ability to even be able to participate in an internship. That baffled me. Guess who can solve for that? A very asynchronous community like open source, right? So we have some of our students that were on teams that might be in another time zone so that they can work flexible hours. Some of the students had to pick up college courses, and we managed to work around their schedule. That's what it meant to be all in. That's what it meant to give students who are often overlooked, who are just need that shot. We just wanted to crack the door open for them so that they could just have an opportunity. And we did that through the amazing partnership of schools, organizations, and corporate partners. So whenever I show this slide, I say, this is what it looks like to open source diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we have plenty of room up here for other logos, and there's some that's going to get up at it already. But then when I look at this inaugural class, this is also what it looks like to open source diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is our first cohort of graduates of All In. And guess what? We started with 30 in the pilot. We are growing this year by 10x. There will be 300 students that will be going through All In. And I have to admit, I settled on 300 because Microsoft and GitHub was like, when are we getting to 1,000 and 10,000, please? And I was like, whoa, wait. Because one thing about it, I just told you about the experiences of these students. Giving them technical education and a training course, there actually was still some gaps that we didn't see. That's why I wanted to keep the pilot small. It never occurred to me, it does now, that if you have students that never had an internship and you're going to throw them into a corporate internship for the first time in a virtual environment, what does that mean for them? They're like, oh, you wanted me to show up at work like every day at 9 o'clock? I thought this was like a class schedule or whatever. Just things like that. Their elevator pitch, communication. There were some students that they needed more of an intensive program. So next year, what we're going to do is for some of those students that need more of an intensive experience, we're not just going to send them their first year to a corporation. We're going to build, I'm going to make this name up right now, like the Open Source Academy, where for 10 weeks, they will be with us getting more and more in-depth experience, more and more training, giving them what they need. That's what it means to be all in. They are not a number to just push through a program and say you graduated. We're going to get them job placement. If they need training for public speaking and presentation skills, we're going to get them that. We had some students who identified as neurodiverse. We got them with training with a neurodiversity coach, someone that was neurodiverse themselves, because we didn't want them hearing from anyone that they needed to train and assimilate in order to fit in. We did strengths-based coaching. Let us understand who you are and what you need, and then we're going to help find the right opportunity and the manager for you. And when I say that I figured out how to get them that coaching, it was through my friend Karsten and Sam Canute at Red Hat. I called them. That's what open source and diversity and inclusion mean. I'm not sitting here in a silo trying to solve a solution for something. I'm calling on friends, everyone in this room, to help us. And so I want to make sure that what you're hearing today is understanding that this is not a program. It's not a set of programs. All In is a community. It is a community of people. It's all of us coming together with your best, your thoughts, your ideas, your energy, your resources, the money from your companies and organizations, jobs, whatever it is. That's what it means. So we need all of you to participate. Here's how you can participate. You can join the community. Go to allinopensource.com. If you are a company or an organization, you can agree to hire interns next summer. Or if you want to contribute financially, we have ways that we can take your money too. And we need it. Because all of the students, not only did we give them those things that I talked about, each one of them received professional headshots. We actually had a photographer go to their schools because a lot of them didn't even have headshots to go onto their LinkedIn profiles. And we wanted to make sure that access was not an issue as well. Every student received a free MacBook as part of the program as well. Because what we learned were some students didn't take internships over the last couple of years because they didn't have a laptop at home. So we have to make sure that we're addressing those things as well. So lots of opportunity for you all to join. And so please know that I extend this invitation. Let's open source diversity and inclusion. Thank you. So I'm going to be joined up here for Q&A with my friend Karsten. I moved all these on because I thought I was going to be walking all over, and then they told me to stay still. So do we need to go over there? We just need to sit down, though, Karsten.
Well, you can swing your legs if you want.
And so we have about 30 minutes, but I want to make sure. So Karsten is going to ask me a few questions, but if you all have questions, just raise your hand, and we'll interrupt here as well.
Yeah, thanks. We'll see if any of these questions are ones that people got in their mind, and then we'll do the cleanup. So. Okay, well, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us at Scale. This is one of my favorite shows that I've told you before.
You
so I
told me like 5 or 6 times. Yeah.
Well, so Demetris, I know that you've had a really successful career in serving in the chief of staff and at senior director level roles. And what prompted you to launch the all-in open source community at this point in your career?
Yeah, so when I maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, I had the opportunity to really think about what I wanted to do next in my career. Typically, I haven't had that space. But one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to go back to my first love, which I was a computer science major in undergrad, and through a series of twists and turns, which we can talk about because I think that's an issue with inclusion as well, I kind of got away from tech. But then I said I wanted to go back, and it was funny enough, I moved back to North Carolina. I signed up for my first programming class because, listen, y'all, I was a really good programmer, C++, which totally dates me. But I was like, I'm going to go and be a programmer again. And I think I was like an hour into the class, and I was like, so I'm going to be on the business side of tech again? And so then I just thought about what would really make a difference. And you hear all sorts of statistics about people of color, women, just being underrepresented in tech. And specifically with open source, I know how important it was for programs for me. Coming from a really poor background, it was so funny. When I graduated high school, my mother, with 3 kids in college, was making $13,000 a year. And so I just think about all those programs. Project Breakthrough, which is a program for HBCU students that IBDM had. I was one of their interns. Project Uplift. There were so many of these impactful programs. And it's so funny when I hear about those programs, most people are like, are they really effective? And I'm like, ooh, they're very effective. Like a lot of people are like, if you can't scale it, if you can't help millions and millions of students, it's not worth the ROI. And I was like, without those programs, you wouldn't have a me, and you wouldn't have a lot of my fellow classmates. And so I said, I want to join an organization which is going to let me figure out what type of program I want to create, and that's why I created All In.
All right. That makes sense. So then it's not really hyperbole to say that the advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in technology in particular has been a part of your life's work, right?
It's a part of my life's work. Yeah, I live and breathe it every day, and my daughter comes every day. She was like, what are we doing with All In, Mom? And she's 11, and so she'll go to school and start talking about it as well. And so this is what we talk about at the dinner table at night. It's my life's work.
Oh, I love it. And so in your professional roles and your open source involvement were reflected those things. But what are some of the trends that you would notice that have got more, as you've got more involved in this effort of trying to make open source more inclusive?
Yeah, I mentioned it briefly, but one of the things that I was I was astounded by. There's a lot of people that's working on diversity and inclusion in tech and even in open source. There's a lot of articles, there's a lot of money being spent. And so when I look at how much effort and finances are going to diversity and inclusion, and then I look at the numbers, as my 11-year-old said, the math ain't mathing. I was like something is happening here. And what I started seeing was that everybody's focused in the same areas, like that top of the funnel. They want to give students internships, or they say, we're going to do this. Once you graduate, then we're going to have all these amazing opportunities for you. There are so many hurdles that students and people have to even get to those internships. I love when a company says, oh, we're going to go to this school and we're going to give them all of these certifications for free that they can take. And I was like, but they don't have laptops. And they don't have Wi-Fi on their campus. How are they? They don't even have professors that's teaching their coding classes. How are we going to get them to your amazing certifications? But no one wants to do that work. That's the long term. That's not the easy ROI. That's not the work you see in the headlines. That's where you might only impact 5 students at a time. No one wants to do that, but that's where the equity lies. So that's when you start hearing a lot of people take away equity. They'll say, let's just do diversity and inclusion, or let's just do belonging, or let's just do justice. But they don't like that equity word because that's where the hard work is.
Yeah, and that's what struck me first when I thought, I'm like, wow, how are we going to work on equity? Because I knew that was the tough one. And also when we first met, you were in the middle of your maintainers listening tour, and I know you've picked up a lot of things on the way. So what are some of the interesting things that you would highlight or recall for all of us from that?
Yeah, I think for the maintainers, I mentioned it earlier, like, they kind of know what they need, and they had never been given the platform for us to really listen to them. Some of the amazing things that I saw come out just in the listening tour, especially in person, there was one, I don't know if you were at this one, it might have been another conference where I did the listening tour, where one of the maintainers, she raised her hand, small community, and she was like, one of the big things that I have is that we'll have someone that's new to open source. They're coming to our community. We give them opportunities. They get upskilled. They start learning. They start doing really impactful work for us. And then they're hired away by a company. And we celebrate that. But then all of a sudden, we have this big hole or gap in our community that no one can fill. And oftentimes, they're doing a lot of the work that we need for them to do to advance diversity and inclusion within our community. So this one maintainer, she said they had someone that was working on removing the dead names from their code. And they were doing that, and they got about 80% done, 80% complete, and then they were hired away. And so that project has just been languishing for over a year now. And all of a sudden, someone from a very large community was like, we had like 300 people working on that for us, and now they're looking for their next project. We're going to send them over to you next week, and they'll get that done for you. And that was like a light bulb moment. Why aren't we doing more of that? That literally is open sourcing, like diversity and inclusion. That's open source. And so one of the things that I found was just this partnership between, it's not a competition. People want to work together. People that are saying, Demetris, just tell us what to do, and I promise you we'll do it. They just say it was so many resources in there that were overwhelmed. So those are some of the things that I saw that really, really just struck with me on that piece of it.
Yeah, and I remember another part of what you found, and that really struck me as well, was that you found the data that showed that people who were in marginalized communities or minority status were creating communities that were amongst themselves, right? And and some folks might see that as a positive outcome, but what's the other side? What's the concerning side about that?
Yeah, so just to give everyone a little bit of context, when we were looking at the data from the open source survey, we started seeing very high numbers of people of color and women that said that they felt welcome in open source if they were a maintainer. And I mean, it was like a really huge spike. And I was like, that's something to be celebrated. Like people who, make it into leadership roles, they feel welcome. And so then we started talking to some of the maintainers from the Maintainers Listening Tour. And right at the end, it struck me. I started asking the question, why did you start your community? And what they said was, we tried to join larger communities or communities where we were in the minority, and we didn't feel welcome. So therefore, we went and created our own community over here. And then I said, are we creating separate but equal? Like, not intentionally, but that's what it's coming out as. And so now you have these larger communities that are like, we need more people in leadership. And those that try to be in leadership are like, nope, we're not joining your community. We're going over here and creating our own. So what seemed like something that should be a great thing to celebrate, it actually has like some undertones to it that I think that we need to address. So when I talk about joining with universities, that's what I want them to research. No offense to anybody in the research space, and they are my friends. I'm working on some amazing work with them. But I was like, we do not need another research project on how to create more inclusive communities. Like, there's like a million research papers on that. Let's start digging into that work, that separate but equal work, to see what's going on there. That's when we can start, finding solutions.
Yeah. I see. Can we save a questions for the
Yes.
end? Thank you. Let's shift a little bit because I was thinking also about what you were doing when we first met. You were right in the middle of that first cohort of students, and I mean, you brought tears to my eyes seeing the pictures, and I love the professional headshots like that. Those polishing pieces are such a huge difference for overcoming biases and at the first run. And there are a lot of camps and educational programs and things out there that are for students. Especially in technology and even in open source. And what do you see as really the different for students, for All In for Students compared to a lot of the others?
Yeah, you mentioned there's a lot of boot camps out there, a lot of programs, corporate organizations and otherwise. But I think, not to sound cliche, but we're all in with these students. Yeah. Like, we just don't stop. I'll give you a prime example of what this meant. It was right after the holiday break. The students came back and they were supposed to go with Major League Hacking and, do their, I think it was 10 hours a week. And we got an email from a student, and the email was very short and curt. It was like, I can't do 10 hours a week, so basically y'all need to figure something out. And most people would have been, organizations or boot camps would have been like, oh, you can't make the requirements, you're out. Like, it would have been no questions asked. But I actually picked up the phone and called our professors. I called the professors and said, what's going on? And they sent me the article where she was in a really bad car accident, like concussion protocol. She wasn't even supposed to be in school this semester, but she said she has to graduate on time because she can't afford to extend for another year. So here I would have, if I did it just quick, if I was just looking at her as a number, she would have been gone from the program, replaced with someone else who wanted the MacBook and, the free stipends and the academic credit. But I told these students, I was like, we're not letting any of you go. I was like, this might sound a little cultish, but I will call we've been on the phone with parents. We've been on the phone with professors, the deans of their schools. We've been involved with them even during the internship process. We are really, really making sure that we go all in and really address the needs of their students. We are not letting them fail. But I can tell you that my boss reminds me of every day, it's not sustainable. Like this, you're 30 students almost wore me out. So imagine 300 students, imagine 10,000 students. So that's where we're looking now. We're going to be issuing some RFPs. We're going to have partners, people that do this and do it well, that bring what they do to the table. We can't solve it all ourselves. One of my pet peeves is when companies try to create a university, tech company. I'm like, you're not a university. Why are you doing that? Go and give money to a university and let them do it well. And so we can't be all the things, right? And so that's what we're doing with All In. I think that's what makes it different. We're not looking at it at a competitive advantage. Someone asked me when I first started this program, he was a member of a C-suite of a company. He was like, Demetris, this is an amazing program, but you're open sourcing it. What if somebody comes and steal your idea and just take it and they do it? And I'm like, yes, that's what I want them to do, because that means it's going to be 30 times 30 times 30 times 30. And he looked at me like I was crazy. He was like, why don't you start a B Corp? Nope. I'm not doing it. So everything that's in my head, I am pushing it out and hoping that people not compete with us, but join with us to do it. And I think that's the difference with All In.
Yeah, and I really feel like you've caught that spirit of what makes open source work when people are inclusive, and being able for all of us to work together through this model. I mean, yeah, that's what sold me on it I just was.
Oh,
my
you're
heart
in,
jumped
Carson.
on it.
You're
so
in. I
was
grabbed you.
I love it. So speaking of the similar thing of we looked at the little bit of the wall of funders aspect and all those and the participation, and where does open source software funding fit in to the picture of All In?
We got to pay people.
Yeah.
I was speaking at a conference. It was virtual at the height of COVID, and someone put in the chat, and they were like, contributing to open source is a privilege. And I was thinking that, I don't know what I thought they were talking about, but I actually picked up the phone, and called the person, and well, it was on Zoom and scheduled a meeting. And she was like, even during the pandemic, if we didn't have time, if it's not your full-time job, like some people still view open source as a hobbyist activity, extracurricular activity. So if you don't have all of the support that you need at home, or if you're not working multiple jobs, or all those things, you don't have time to contribute to open source. And so when I started talking to a lot of maintainers, they were like, there's some amazing people that can help them in their communities, but they can't afford to pay them. And they have other jobs and they have other commitments, so they kind of come and go as they can. And I was like, I think with all the money that we make in tech, I think that's like one of the easiest things to solve for. But then, a lot of times people think you need like buckets and buckets of cash. One of the things that struck me when we were doing the Maintainers Listening Tour, I was talking to some folks that were internationally, it was a contributor in Africa, as a matter of fact, Nigeria specifically. And I was like, yeah, we heard about lack of infrastructure, and you all don't have access to data and blah, blah, blah. And she said, that's not our problem. We got access to data all over the place. And I was like, oh, well, what is it? She was like, it's so expensive to actually connect to the data, and that's why we can't participate. And I was like, oh, well, how much is that going to cost? Because I'm thinking we need to go build some power lines or something. I don't know. And she was like, probably if you gave every person that wanted to contribute to your community like $200 a year, and that would get them unlimited data. And I'm like, y'all aren't contributing and aren't participating. You're shut out for $200. I was like, what? What does that even mean? And so that's where I think we have to really think about and look at and really break down what does funding diversity and inclusion look like, because a lot of people are thinking it needs to be millions and millions and billions of dollars, but sometimes it could be as simple as $200 for data for a year, or a MacBook or a laptop for them to do an internship. Yeah. And so we're solving for that, even through our corporate sponsors program with GitHub.
Well, so shifting to just some questions about the advancing of diversity, equity, and inclusion in open source, and from the broad perspective, as a lot of people know that contributing to open source software for the first time can be, it can be daunting for new people, even if no matter how eager they are to be doing it. So, from your research, what are some specific steps that projects can do, like the Drupal community, that to take to foster that more inclusive and welcoming atmosphere?
For any community, documentation is going to be critical. People are looking at your documentation as soon as they come into your community, trying to figure out how they can contribute. How can they be a part of, whatever it is that you're doing. Have robust documentation, and I think that's the thing that's most often overlooked. And then the second thing I would say that we've heard a lot of is just community hospitality. When someone joins your community, you can have, through GitHub Actions, by the way, shameless plug, you can have it where as soon as someone joins your community, it sends them an instant message that says, hey, welcome to our community. This is how you can contribute. We're glad you're here. Your voice is really, really valued here. Just those small little steps like that. That was the number one thing that we were hearing out of the survey that said can advance diversity and inclusion. I think a lot of people were thinking it was going to say, hey, closed captions for every meeting, which is also very, very important, or, all of these other things that you might not have time. But they were like, no, just let us know that you see that we're here. And that could be something that's automated. So documentation, community hospitality. If you get those two things, I think that you are going, you're well on your way to advancing diversity and inclusion in your community. And then we can start doing some of the equity things.
As a docs writer, that's maybe another reason why you won my heart over from the beginning, was
Yes.
with the proof in the pudding. So from another perspective, you mentioned how crucial it is for open source communities to be sharing and working with each other about their experiences with diversity, equity, and inclusion. What are some of the mistakes that you've seen open source maintainers make with diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think the number one mistake that I've seen, and it's not a mistake, it's just an opportunity, I would say, if I had to change the word
That's
a little
my
bit.
word, okay. What is
It was funny. And so during the listening tour, I was having individual conversations, and it was always a maintainer of a large community or a well-resourced community. And they would say, Demetris, we're doing all of these efforts. We're, having these spaces for people to come and learn about our community. We're having these diversity and inclusion talks so that we can start identifying future leaders. All these things that we've set up, we're pouring thousands and thousands a year into this, but no one's showing up. We can't find women or people of color anywhere. They won't come. And so I'll ask them a question, and I love asking this question. It's almost like, and I already know the answer, but it cracks me up to see their face. But I'll say, well, tell me about your marketing efforts for those events that you're having. And they were like, oh, yeah, we're sending out on Twitter and LinkedIn. And I was like, who's Twitter and LinkedIn? And they were like, ours, our leadership team. And I was like, let me see your friends list on each of these platforms. And when I look at their friends list, I was like, they look like you. Like, all of them typically are white men. So if you're sending this out to a bunch of white men, who do you think are going to show up? You have to expand your personal networks. And I think that that's something that is often overlooked for maintainers. People join communities, they're almost like, friends that join together. I've heard so many communities start from people meeting at conferences like this, or they're hanging out at a bar somewhere. It's friends and family members, and they start this community, and then they bring in the people that they know and the people that they know. And even myself included, most of our personal networks are people that are similarly situated to us. So if your community, if your personal network looks like this, and that's all you're advertising to, you're never going to reach a broad and diverse audience to bring them into your community, to introduce yourself. So I would say make sure that you're going to conferences, not just with your friends and the ones you know and that you've been going to year over year. Keep coming to Scale, because we need to Scale 20 and 2021 or whatever. But there's also other conferences that you can be a part of, whether it's Afrotech, whether it's some for the Hispanic community. Go there as well and start expanding your personal network. And I think that's the number one mistake that I see. People trying to advance the diversity and inclusion with people that look just like them or from the same backgrounds or the same, abilities.
Excellent, thanks. Well, I'm mindful we have got a few minutes left. I want to make sure we have there's at least one question in the queue. I was going to ask you one more thing about what you thought about the future of diversity, equity, inclusion, and open source. So we can. Do you want to wrap that one, or do you want to go ahead and jump to?
I'll go with questions.
Okay. Well, I've got Guinevere's, I think, over here on this side.
It was one all the way over here first. The mat. Yep, I think she was first.
Do we have
the amazing skirt, by the way?
Yeah.
I think I need that.
Yes.
Yeah, so I really love the effort of going out to colleges that have traditionally been underrepresented. How do you empower those students to advocate for themselves? When they get to their first job offer, they will be paid less than their more privileged counterparts. That's just the numbers.
Yeah.
How can we change that?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is just arming them with information. And that's why I said as part of our curriculum, we went into what does finances look like? What are typical salary ranges? How can you start reaching out to people to talk about what, different salary ranges and those things are? But what I've learned through the summer is that the students, they still aren't there yet. We're talking about how can they advocate for themselves, and we still have a lot of these students that are dealing with a lot of imposter syndrome. Just to ask them, hey, what have you been working on this week? You would think that's like one of the hardest questions that they've ever heard before. And so just getting them more and more comfortable hearing their voices in front of those. We noticed that when we first started all in the fall semester, they were working with a lot of folks on my team and folks that looked like them from underrepresented background. When we put them into, and they were very engaged. When we put them into Major League Hacking, and those are, they're my friends, but mostly white people, you saw the students just clam up inside of themselves. And it was amazing to watch that, but I was like, we have to even get them more exposed to people to realize that they're gonna have to work with people from all parts of the world, and they need to be comfortable in themselves. And I think that's just practice, and it's having people that do it and do it well. It's not us doing it. That's why I said we're partnering with an organization, and we're trying to find one that they know how to do this and do it well to get these students prepared. So it's definitely a step-by-step process. Thank you. Yes.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about resource allocation. So I work on a lot of open source hardware. And so one of the problems we have with our projects is, in order to be a contributor, you need to have access to the ability to put together a circuit board. You need to have access to Fusion 360 to then maybe if you have a 3D printer or something along those lines. So there's individually each one of those things, to your point about speaking about privilege and the ability to contribute, now it's not just a time thing, you also have to have a resource thing. And so I'm wondering if you could speak about how one goes about expanding an open source hardware project to be more inclusive, while at the same time recognizing that we are also strapped for cash and can't be, oh, here's a $2,000 care package to
Yeah.
just give you your whatever you need to start.
Yeah, I think the number one way is making people know what the work is that you're trying to. It's so funny that when you said that, my ears perked up. I have a student that they said that after the summer, they realized they don't want to do software, they want to do hardware. And I was like, I don't know where to tell you to go. Who's working on hardware? And so, so us having this conversation and knowing what everyone's doing in these pockets of open source, we can then connect. Because I can solve for the funding. Like I have this one student, if you tell me he needs a whatever, like, it's not like $1 million or something, right? Like if it's enough and it's reasonable, we can get there. There's foundations that have been reaching out to us. The Ford Foundation has generously funded us. We're talking to the Sloan Foundation, the Linux Foundation. They have been all over the place. And they're like, if it's money, tell us what you need. But we've just been trying to figure out where best to get the money. And so I think it's just us having these conversations. And that's where open source and diversity and inclusion, that's where it comes into play. So if your community says, we want to take on 5 students, we would need $10,000 to take on 5 students, and we can match, then that's what it looks like when we're all coming to the table and bringing what we can bring to the table. I'm sure Cisco, Intel, all of those companies that deal with hardware, they would love to, if you all are in corporate sponsor, GitHub sponsors, to be able to send money your way to do that, especially for those from underserved communities. Yes.
Entrepreneurism and the networking, say, of churches and existing. Can you maybe talk about some of the strategies or ways that you think that we can approach building those type of resources?
Yeah, so I would say it's 2 things. One of the things that we've learned through this pilot, we talked about corporate program, the corporate partners are getting the students for internships at these corporate partners. Not everybody wants to go work for a major corporation. They want to work for smaller, organizations like startups. They want to contribute directly to communities because they have entrepreneurial dreams. They want to be a founder one day. And so that's why for this next iteration of All In, we're looking for not just corporate partners. So I probably need to change the name of that. We're looking for any organization that's willing to host students because people want different experiences. We're looking at schools in Washington, D.C., and they're saying, hey, we actually want to stay in D.C. Are there government agencies that do open source? And so we need government agencies there. So to the point that you're making about, churches and nonprofit organizations, we started the pilot with students because they were a readily available demographic, but we are going to expand All In for everyone that wants this type of opportunity because we realize there are retirees, there are community leaders, there are people that are more advanced in their community, and they want to give back. So we were like, let's teach them open source so that they can go to the communities that have these young folks that they can actually start bringing into the communities in places that we can't reach. So we are definitely expanding All In so they can be for, like I said, retirees, for career changers, people that are currently and formerly incarcerated. I always say open source is the lowest barrier to entry in tech. And so we need to be reaching out to more and more. So we definitely have that in our roadmap. Yes, I have a question there and a question here, too.
Okay. We have time for maybe 2 more. So
Yep.
we'll start here.
I'm Sam Coleman. I had a kind of a complex question. What it is that when I did my doctoral research, it was on open source technology and public education about 6, 7, 8 years ago.
Oh,
and
I need
a
that
lot of
research.
people in this room had a pretty significant impact on my development in open source. And all these people don't look like me, and I love them, and they may or may not know who they are. I'm just going to say that it's important that we need to recognize the level of impact that we have on people. I wouldn't have become Dr. Coleman unless I had a lot of people in this room help me. My question to you is this. Through your survey, have you been able to identify the entry points into open source for people of color? Because for me, I kind of stumbled into Scale in 2004. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I was looking around like, who are these guys? Kind of cool, And so I was wondering, has your survey gathered that data so that we can kind of analyze what the entry points are to maybe help hasten that process?
Yeah, we didn't ask that question specifically, but we have enough data in some other questions that I think we can make some assumptions about some things. Because there was still a high number of people that they got exposure to open source through their undergraduate curriculum. But then when we can start looking, and there's been some research that if you look at historically black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions, they don't have open source curriculum. So there's a gap there. So we started seeing an entry point that more people of color came into open source later in their careers. It was after they had already been, working for sometimes over a decade before they even got exposure to it. And so that's what we were looking at in All In. How can we infuse it more and more into curriculum? And we're looking at Microsoft TILS, which they train people to teach computer science education in high schools. And so I told them, I want open source curriculum as part of your curriculum now so that we can train people. If you have a local high school in your community, you can go get trained through Microsoft TILS, where you can go once a week or once a month to actually introduce open source curriculum. So we have some data, and the data is open. Anything that's not anonymous, and so we have the data set. So I would love to partner with you just to look at your research to see whether or not we can start building some type of, research and data around that and something we can solution. Oh, awesome. Well, send me the clip note. Everybody sends me their
Love you.
dissertation. Love it. Oops. Okay, last question.
Oh my. Hi, my name's Salona. I was wondering, so you talked about a lot of the universities and things of that nature. Have you looked more at like technical colleges and, community colleges that have the associate degrees? Because they have a lot of programs there to help bring people up, and they kind of know what they're doing in regards to that. And so like bringing in this to them, I think could be extremely useful. I used to be a director at ITT.
Oh, sweet.
So, and I totally changed the curriculum to make everything up on the internet so that they all had websites and portfolios, and they graduated into jobs.
Nice.
And so it's like open source has that same thing where you can just graduate into a job if you've got the code already there.
Correct. So to answer your question, yes. So the pilot we did at those 6 schools, but for this full program this year, we're expanding it to any student that goes to a minority serving institution. So that's for Asian and Pacific Islanders, women, tribal colleges, Hispanic serving institutions, as well as historically black colleges and institutions. They can go to a community college, or they can go to a predominantly white college as well if they are from an underrepresented background in tech, specifically focused on women and racial and ethnic minorities in the U.S. And we are already talking to Brazil about what does this look like to start introducing this into South America as well. So community colleges are welcome to participate this year. Thank you. Is that it?
I think that's it. All right.
Oh.
Yeah, you said
Time
last
flies,
question.
right? Oh, and I'm over time.
So,
Thank you all so much.
so thank you both for joining us and for this the fantastic conversation. Very, very insightful. There's